Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. This is the podcast where we talk about the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our happiness, and our productivity. And of course, we always talk about sustainable design as well. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski. Today, I have David and Marina from Fame Architecture and Interior Design, and they're also partners in the Second Studio podcast. David and Marina, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, David Lee, and I'm going to pronounce Marina's last name just because I can. Marina Bourderonnet. Is that? Did we get it?
Yeah. That's really good.
All right. Yeah. I'm proud of myself. It is wonderful to have you both here. Let's begin by learning a little bit about both of you. Let's start with Marina. Please tell us about your journey that led you to Fame and to Second Studio.
Oh boy. Well, I'm from France. I grew up in a small town. I studied architecture in Paris. I think probably got inspired to get into architecture through my dad, basically always, building things in the house. Moved to New York, worked there for quite a few years and, did everything from small interior design stores to like big towers and beach houses. So kind of saw like the whole spectrum. And then eventually decided to move back west where David is from to start our own practice, Fame Architects.
Okay. Now, David, how about your origin story?
Mine's not as interesting because I'm not from France. So I grew up in Southern California in Orange County, actually the city of Orange County, it's kind of relatively small suburb, not a whole lot going on there, save for Disneyland being 5 minutes away, which was a lot of fun as a kid. The sort of long version of it is that I actually did not want to do architecture. I was more interested in industrial design in the beginning when I was in high school. And I had attended an architecture summer camp at the University of Southern California when I was a junior in high school. And for better or for worse, within the first day and a half of that program, I was hooked on the architecture education side of it, at least. And I knew from that point that's what I wanted to do for college, for my studies. So I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in California, got a bachelor's of architecture and a minor in sustainable environments, studied music as well. And then, as Marina said, then after that is when the two of us moved to New York City. So we were both there for several years. And at that time, I got a master's in urban design, the City College of New York with Michael Sorkin when he was around. And we both worked at a bunch of different offices doing a bunch of different work. As she said, we had a great time on the East Coast, but I think we always knew that we wanted to have our own practice. I suspect it's because we're too irreverent and rebellious in our nature. So came back to California, for Marina moving to California, and then we started our practice. The podcast actually predates our office by a couple years. So we started the podcast when we were in New York, in fact. So it's a little bit older than the office.
Okay. Yeah, I have to jump on one thing that you just said there. You mentioned music. What is it about architecture and music? I know so many architects and a lot of engineers too that are also, weekend musicians or at least hobby musicians. What do you think is the connection there?
I've thought about this a lot, and I sometimes struggle to find words to express that connection. I will say that when I'm working on our projects, I do think of them sort of as music. It's not a conscious, active thought process, but in the back of my mind, that's how I critique things, is as if it was a music composition. I think that formally, there's definitely a lot of parallels between music and architecture. The space, the light, the silence, the crescendos, there's a lot you can kind of draw from that. I think that for creatives and even engineers as well, I think I know for me at least, the reason why I like music is that it's a very visceral and immediate response to what you're creating. And that's one of the challenges or the downsides of architecture, is that we operate in a very conceptual space of planning. We don't build the thing, and the thing takes very long to build. So the satisfaction is over a long period of time. It takes a lot of patience. But with music, when you're playing a piece, it's immediate. And if it's great, you feel it immediately. And if it's bad, also, you feel it immediately. But it's a way to express the creativity in a much more, again, satisfying manner that's very responsive. So I suspect that's why there's the draw. And I think also the formal components, as I mentioned, is something that's quite obvious. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I'm so glad I'm recording this because that was a great answer. I appreciate that. All right, we're going to talk about fame for just a minute. I'm going to go off script. Forgive me, but where did you get the name? Why did you choose that name for the
She came up with the name.
No,
Okay.
he did actually. Well, naming thing is probably actually one of the hardest thing to do. Designing a building is semi-hard, but finding a name for anything, I think, is very difficult. We for sure wanted to get away from the more corporate way of naming an office, which is basically using the founder's last name. His last name is too short and too common, and mine, nobody can pronounce it or spell it. So it didn't seem like the smart way to go about a name. I think we also thought about what would the office evolve to in the future. And, ideally, it's not going to be just the two of us as the partners or the founders. Like, we want a bigger team, a bigger office, and, make it more of a collective or a group eventually. So kind of detaching ourselves from the name of the founders, but trying to create something that's bigger than that was kind of our approach.
It's also fun. I mean,
I also wanted something that's a bit more unusual. Sometimes architects have the reputation to be very uptight, very serious people, and what you're expecting them, what you see in the movies. And we're not really that kind of architects. So we figured we need a name that just kind of like transcribes that.
I like that. I like that very much. All right. There's a statement on your website, and I'm going to read it now. We excel in intimate renovations, full remodels, and large-scale new builds, and have been recognized for our sensitivity to clients' lifestyles and translating their individual desires into an ideal home. Love that quote. Okay, can you explain, and maybe with some examples, how clients' lifestyles translate into home design?
That's the $1 million question. And it's interesting because as we've worked with more and more clients, I think the answer to that and how it works is much more complex than maybe most people would think, and certainly from what I thought, 10 years ago. It's not as some aspects of the design are as simple as understanding, let's say, the programmatic requirements. How many bedrooms and bathrooms do you need? Do you want your kitchen to be open or closed? How many what kind of refrigerator do you need? How many kitchens do you need? Like basic kind of quantifiable stuff like that gets worked into the design. That's true. But as we've evolved, it's become much more than that. And it's really about understanding the people, making a very strong connection with the people, the clients. And I think actually the podcast has helped us with that skill. And so it requires a lot of time and research and thought and care to understand a human being and understand how they are projecting themselves to live and how they want to live in this future state, which will be the home in their new life with the home. And so how we do that, we have a questionnaire, which is fairly long. It's about 6 pages. We take the time to meet with the clients and talk about their answers. If there's partners involved, we make sure that they each answer the questionnaires separately and on their own. And then we have a group discussion to find out where the commonalities and misalignments are. But I'll give an example of one of the projects that's ongoing that has a particular conceptual angle to it that came from the client and pretty much almost nothing else. There's a couple we're working with, extremely smart, very successful, kind of intimidating actually on paper. And they bought this house and this property. And the property is a decent size. It's not giant. We're not talking about acres, but it had a lot of lush greenery in the backyard, which was the most magical part of the property. And we had learned more about the two of them, and specifically that the husband, he literally grew up in a forest when he was a kid and has all these outdoor extreme kind of activities that he's done. And they both, him and the wife, have a strong connection to the outdoors. So that was something we learned in that questionnaire process. And in the design of the home, we understood the program and we decided that we would create the house so it complements the nature in the backyard, which we call the forest kind of conceptually. And even more specifically, that the floor plan, the layout, and geometries of the house exist to invoke the sense of movement that a body takes when you're moving through a forest. So when you move through a forest, it's not a straight path. You're kind of going around objects, below and above fallen trees, and this kind of poetry of how you move and experience the forest. And that became the essence of the project. And that, again, is only a result of us understanding the clients, where they grew up and how they lived and who they are as people. So that's, again, like pretty far from, again, the basic bedroom and bathroom count. But I think when we get to know people on that level, it allows us to extract really unexpected things for the projects.
Marina, did you want to add anything to that? That was a brilliant answer, but I definitely want to give you an opportunity to jump in there.
Yeah, no, I think that's, lifestyle is kind of maybe a term that's overused these days, and oftentimes it's really understood more as a very rudimentary, functional, like your workout routine, your schedule, and kind of like all of those constraints. In our mind, lifestyle is again much more about who you are and how does that fit with your personality, right? So that's where we can, we're very good at accommodating functions and understanding how our clients live in their homes or how they intend on living. But that's very much paired very strongly with who they are as people. That's how we define lifestyle.
And the poetry of the house. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have to ask and this is purely just for fun. You talked about the questionnaire and then, you have people answer it independently and then you bring them together. Have you ever had any sort of contentious moments in that conversation?
All the time. Yeah. Yeah. It's actually a very interesting exercise because if clients take it seriously and they answer with their own answers and not trying to please their partner, you really get to see like what is meaningful and most important to them. And sometimes they're very different. Sometimes they're not in line. Sometimes they're very much in sync, which all of those small things, I think, just give you a hint of what is their dynamic as a family, as a couple, and within a shared space, right? It also gives us hints. Do they each need their own space in the house that kind of allows them to exist individually versus always being together in every spaces in the home? So it's pretty telling. It's pretty telling.
It also gives us insights to what it's going to be like to work with both of them as individuals, but as a group of four, let's say. And that's a very important thing for us to understand before we embark on a project. So we know how to temper our communications in a specific manner for them so it's the most productive. And frankly, also sometimes so we know that this is not the right fit for us. We shouldn't be working with these people for whatever reasons.
Right. So you both have to be psychologists a little bit as well as being architects.
I would say so. Yeah, that's a big part of it. And from the client's perspective, it's also being a friend and someone that they can trust and feel like that there's comfort and security in, because as you know, these projects take a really long time. They do get stressful.
Yes.
All projects get stressful. All projects have problems that no one was expecting. And it's key for everybody, especially the client, to feel like they're surrounded by people who have their backs when things don't go right. So that's, I think, a big part of understanding the people is that aspect as well.
Wonderful. Okay. This is a pure sort of design question, and I'm gonna start by reminding everybody that I'm an engineer, and when you're in engineering school, they basically reach in your brain, just remove the right side of the brain altogether. You're no longer allowed to keep that. So
you have it in a jar somewhere. That's
it's in a lab somewhere on some shelf, but it's not in my head anymore. So forgive me as I ask this one. So I was fortunate enough to have Lila Allen from Architectural Digest Pro is one of my earlier guests, and she introduced me to the fact, and I guess it is a fact, that minimalism is dead, right? Minimalism was most of my life. Minimalism was at the core of especially residential design. What has replaced minimalism? And for us non-architects, can you help us understand, the key elements of whatever this new style is that's taken over?
I don't know if minimalism is dead, like I feel like there is a wider range. I think we notice more and more that oftentimes let's say what we call modernism, like more modern architecture and design, could be associated with a lot of people as something that is cold, right? And maybe that's the part of minimalism that is dead, is that people are very sensible in making sure that the home that they're designing is not going to feel like sterile austere or cold. Some clients definitely want that, and there are very a handful of them who likes that. But most people want the home to feel, warm, welcoming, and kind of again a reflection of themselves. So I would say the code aspect of modern design is definitely gone. What's replaced it? That's a good question. I feel like there is always kind of like a comeback of mid-century that's been contemporized. So it's a little bit updated mid-century. To me, it's not necessarily as charming and truthful as the real mid-century was. We do see a lot of, trends of just keeping everything neutral. People are also sensible of the resale value of their homes and the design choices that they make. So, there's people who go flashy, there's people who go just very subtle in all of the finishes and material palettes and colors, not to venture into something that's maybe too specific to them.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Which is tricky because, as creative, especially when we work on custom home, you don't necessarily want to repeat what everybody is doing in the magazines and, your neighbor is doing on their house. Like you're hiring creative and professional and you're commissioning them to designing something unique for you, right? So that's why if you design for the masses, you're not designing a custom home anymore. And it's a little switch that people have to be mindful of.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Marina said. It's funny. I think in general, the two of us are we pretty strongly reject any ideas that there are trends that we should be paying attention to trends, honestly, and that this is dead or this is alive or whatever. The two of us don't honestly care about that. It is true in the broadest scope of architectural history that, in any history, that there's the idea of the pendulum that swings back and forth. So we have a movement. You could even see in politics, like we swing to the left and we swing to the right. There's always this sensation of we're swinging from one side to the other. And that is true. And it could be argued that minimalism is becoming less popular because, and I'm talking over the span of like the last, 50 years or so, because we're slowly evolving to a place as a society where we are recognizing the heterogeneity of life and culture. Things are on a spectrum now. Things are not so black and white. Things are not so simple. And I think the recognizing of the complexity of life and of the subtleties of all the different types of people we have, it does bleed over into design and the expression of it being maybe more vibrant and more not so staid. But I think to Marina's last point, our position when we talk with clients is every client wants to create something that's timeless, in quotes. That's the thing, right? I want a timeless design. Well, the way you do that, aside from just having just great architecture, is to do something that's honest to who you are if you plan on living in the house. And that's kind of it. All the stuff in the news about these colors that are popular, or Pantone's is color of the year and whatnot, that's all just noise. You don't need to worry about that. Just focus on what makes sense for you, and then trust us to again extrapolate and do something that's kind of interesting and special. And that's kind of the game or the sandbox that we play in, or at least the mentality that we have.
I like that. If you look at personal style, you mentioned heterogeneity. You look at just individual style, it's so much more heterogeneous than it was when I was, growing up in the 70s and in the 80s. I mean, we all wore the same shirts and the same shoes and had the same hair. And, it's just, the world's just not like that anymore. And I guess it's the same with architecture. And that's a beautiful thing. I'm so glad to hear you articulate that. I have to jump on something Marina said about mid-century. My wife and I just moved into the city about it just a little better than a year ago when we bought a 70-year-old home, and my wife walked in and said, we have to do this completely mid-century. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about, but it's okay. And it worked beautifully. And the part for me that was really interesting, Marina, was how easy it was to find furniture and fixtures and rugs and wall decorations that were mid-century. So apparently it is in a popular sort of genre these days.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's definitely making a comeback. I think it was also probably a time in the design life where a lot of different disciplines were kind of creating all towards something that was in a similar wavelength, like furniture, homeware, like textile, architecture, interior design. Like they are all very much in symbiosis at the time in the way they were designing, which I think is probably what made also mid-century style strong and powerful as a style, right? Because everyone just came together on it. If it was just one architect trying to do mid-century, but everything else was, a hodgepodge of things, it probably wouldn't be the same. Today, what's interesting is there is a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, which is great because it gives you a much broader variety. But in the same time, it's hard to wrap your head around and kind of create a sense of place, which is also why, in our office, we do architecture and interior design at the same time. Like we don't disassociate them, because we very much feel like it's a stronger experience when the two are working hand in hand, rather than, if you hire one person to do one thing and the other person to do the other. And there is the line in the middle that you can never cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much an issue in industrial design. Something we studied in engineering school was the downfall of, what do they call it? Silo design, right?
Yeah.
Where everybody has their own silo that they work in, and then they try to bring it all together, and they're shocked when things don't mesh. So I love that. I love that you spoke to that. I have to change gears a little bit. I want to talk about your podcast. 400 plus episodes. That's truly amazing, and a huge congratulations to you on that. Why do you think you've been so successful and had such amazing longevity?
Oh, I think because we just keep going. We
Yeah.
started the podcast, almost 8 years ago now?
Yeah.
Honestly, I think it's consistency. You have to stick to the schedule. You have to keep going, and we're not running out of things to say, so we're not going to stop anytime soon. We started very much more like a side thing. That was kind of a hobby and a place for us to have a platform where we could talk about a lot of different things, which we're still doing. We're just bringing more and more people to have those types of conversation with, which has been extremely interesting. It's a way for us to kind of stay with the industry without having to go to 50 networking events and talking to 100 of people to have those conversations.
Although we still do that.
We still do that, but having the opportunity to sit down with someone and have a stronger conversation for an hour and a half is not, always something that you can do on a day-to-day, when you go to these types of events, for example. So
Yeah. I think the consistency aspect is correct. The reason why I mentioned earlier that the podcast predates our office is it's sort of an important point in terms of time management, right? Like a lot of people, they're confused as to how we have a practice and then also a podcast. And a lot of people, if they just know us through the podcast, they assume that's like a full-time job or close to it, when it's very far from that. And the answer of how we've been able to do those both is that, again, they didn't start at the same time. So we were able to get the show sort of up and running a little bit and have its legs underneath itself before we embarked on the office. I think that if we had to try and launch a new business, an architecture practice, design practice, and start a podcast at the same time, it would have been like way too much and not really possible. Not to discourage any offices from doing it. I think the reason why we've continued doing the show is, as A, we enjoy it, we think it's meaningful, and the reason why we've gotten traction, I think, is because there are, from what I've seen, there are not so many architecture podcasts that are hosted by practicing architects. Like an architect who has their own office, and my 9 to, I was going to say 9 to 5, my like 9 to 9 is architecture, and then I talk about it on the show, we talk about it on the show. And that's not super common. I also think it's not so common for the host to be, again, as opinionated and as irreverent as we are. We don't say really crazy things on the show, anymore at least, but we don't hold back our thoughts. And I think the listenership that we do have appreciates that, because they're thinking the same thing whilst they're in their office or in their studio working, but it's just that not a lot of people on air, in quotes, are saying it. Whereas we have no problem saying it.
Well, and I think it's interesting for the listeners too, because they kind of get to step into our heads or sit at the table where we're thinking about things, rather than just listening to a class about architecture, which is a very different format of podcasting. A lot of people listen to podcasts to learn things. I think people listen to our podcast because they kind of want to wonder, and I think that's probably what we bring to the table.
That's also a way to say we don't get it right all the time. We see a lot of stuff that's, I don't mean factually incorrect, but things that we would change our opinions on, after a few years go by or whatever it is. And that's part of the nature of the show and why we like it. Is it's not a finite thing. It's evolving as we grow and change as well.
I love it. Have you had any, rock stars on, any like, the famous architects? Have you been able to engage in any conversation with sort of the more household names?
Yeah, we have. We've been very fortunate. Some of the bigger it's interesting too because we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. We've realized that what is a big name is really dependent on where you live. But East Coast wise, we've had on shop architects. We've had I'm forgetting all the East Coast people. Michael Sorkin was on the show, of course. We had Dongping Wong internationally. We had MVRDV. We had Olsen Kundagon. We had James Corner, who designed the High Line. We had Diller Scafidia Renfro. So we've had on a number of big time people. The interesting thing is, and this is not a remark concerning the names I just mentioned, is the fact that an architect is well known and that their work is good does not mean that they're going to be a good guest on the show.
Right, right.
And maybe you've experienced that too. I don't know.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I found that some of the most interesting people I've had on the show, and this, I don't mean to make it about me, but I'd be interested to see if you had a similar experience. People from the media. When I've had people from the media, they've been some of the most interesting guests. And I've speculated that's because they're talking to people in the industry every day and they get a really broad view. And so sometimes, they say the most incredibly insightful things. Have you had people, other podcasters or people from the media on the show that you've had a similar experience with?
Yeah, well, I guess they would count as being in the media, but we had a couple of architecture critics that were on the show. It's always fun to talk to them because they're not the ones designing; they're the one writing about what everybody else is designing,
Right.
and kind of like getting their opinions and how they see things on their end. It's pretty interesting. It's a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, we had Paul Goldberger on, and that was super fascinating. And also kind of a strange moment. Like we've had enough guests on now where we're not really impacted by the name of the guest at this point. However, when Paul was on our show, that was definitely a moment that was very strange for me personally, because when I was a really young kid, probably like 8 or 10, I remember watching a PBS documentary about Frank Lloyd Wright. And Paul Goldberger was one of the speakers on that documentary. And that was, as for whatever reason, it was burned in my memory. This bald guy talking about Frank Lloyd Wright in such an eloquent and interesting manner. And I figured out who he was even at that time. And so I've known about him ever since I was a little kid. So zoom forward to, decades later, we're now talking to him and we're interviewing him on our show. It's a very surreal moment. And as you might expect, he was a phenomenal guest.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah, I'm going to go dig that one out for sure. Did we talk about energy codes at all? Or did I skip
Not
that?
yet.
We haven't. No.
Okay, I want to talk about that. How are these new energy codes? They have very strict, radical leaps in, performance requirements. How are these new energy codes affecting your ability to create beautiful living spaces?
Interestingly enough, I feel like that's probably not been the thing that's been the hardest to deal with, despite being in California. Energy code here in California, we have like Title 24.
Yep.
It's your windows, your wall types, your insulation, your mechanical equipment, your lighting, all of those things. But once you're dialed in, it just becomes routine work. I think what's becoming more and more of a struggle for architects, especially in our state, is all of the local regulation we have to comply, the local agencies that we have to comply to. We do work in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and there is a lot of restrictions on the land and how you can touch and build on those lands. The energy is a kind of a smaller portion of it that I think we've all managed to figure out. But it's kind of like puzzling together all of those local agencies in order to satisfy all of the requirements while still allowing us to design something that's not just a box, that's more interesting than that. And then throw on top of that the building code, which is also adding another layer of things that just, limits ourselves. We went to Switzerland a couple months ago and we visited the Foundation Le Corbusier in Zurich. And there is this beautiful stair inside with, this kind of like quirky open railing. And we're like, this is so cool. It doesn't look like a stair. It looks like more of a sculptural element. And we're like, yeah, but you couldn't do that today because of the building code. Like, you need like so many inches of spacing. You need this to go there and this to go there. And all of these requirements is, what dictates the design nowadays. So you have to be very agile in juggling that and being smart and strategize on how you can find not the loopholes, but like find solutions to get away from that and not just have to comply.
That's a big part of being an architect now. Yeah. And I think that's probably one of the biggest, let's just call it a complaint that the average architect would have, is the amount of regulations is getting more and more, and it doesn't seem to be, it's not going to lessen, it's just going to increase. And so as a result, a lot of the day-to-day practicing is just trying to find ways to meet the minimum requirements so we can move forward. And I think, kind of zooming out, that does pose a problem for the profession, or rather the profession needs to adapt and evolve, because what happens is the amount of time and effort it takes for your average architects to contend with all these regulations is much higher than it once was. At the same time, there's not more hours in the day than there was 50 years ago. So the amount of creative energy that gets used to satisfy these minimum kind of requirements and regulations is sucking up the creative energy from being critical and doing something more interesting. So there's kind of like an extra, not kind of, there is an extra effort, an extra gear that architects have to be able to switch into now to go past just meeting the requirements and to do something interesting. And that's where I think there's generally now, well, in some places, there's more generic work being produced, because I think a lot of architects are just getting tired. They're getting worn out. I mean, I was speaking with a number of architects in LA. I think it was San Francisco. These are architects who are much older than us, been practicing for a very long time, very established, the best architects in the city. And they've been practicing in the city and living in the city for many decades. And they're all fed up. They're like, I'm done practicing in San Francisco. I will go practice. I will do a house or a project anywhere outside of the city, but it would take a lot for me to do something here because it takes so long and it's so difficult to get through all these regulations. It's not worth their time or their clients. To your specific question about energy, I think those regulations are a very good thing. I think it's something that we need to be much better at as like a species, is how we consume and use and source energy. I think material advancements are a huge thing in architecture and will continue to be. Concrete is a material that all architects love, poured in place concrete in particular, but concrete is horrible for the environment. But there are some more recent developments in the material itself and how it can be produced without or with very low carbon emissions. I think in terms of energy, it's also, honestly, it's kind of going back to the basics, like knowing where windows should go and not go for solar heat gain, for wind, and for all of these things. And I find that if you stick to those fundamental, almost like primitive survival strategies of what it means to be on this planet, you can actually do a lot just by doing that.
Yeah, very interesting. Do you find that, the onslaught of regulatory, additions, nobody ever eases up on regulations or backs off or removes regulations. You just pile them on, you get more and more. Is it making it hard to create art?
That's the question. And I think the answer is yes. I mean, you could easily argue that part of the art or the art form is to work with those constraints to find cool solutions. And that's true. But look, the reality is that if you have to contend with 100 restraints versus 2, at some point when you get past 100 to 500 to 1,000 to whatever, it does become quite restricting. I think
you also have to become, you're not just a creative anymore. You have to understand those technical requirements and become an expert at it in order for it not to be stopping you from creating. So now you have to take on 2 roles and take them on well in order to be able to propose something that's still, at a high level.
Yeah. And architecture's always been that. It's always been an exercise of creating an artwork through very pragmatic and realistic, again, criteria. But I think there is a threshold, right, when that becomes too stifling. And I suspect, and the hope among that we have, and I think a lot of architects have, is actually that AI will solve a lot of these things, specifically with the building approval process. So instead of having a plan checker who operates in a gray area, and whether or not you get approved is just subject to how they're feeling that day. Like, let's be honest.
Yes.
That if we have, you've experienced this. Yeah. If we have an AI model that is objective, then that will allow us all to get through and get approved. So it's not that the architects are not able to satisfy and meet these requirements. It's that it's actually honestly probably the gray area of the human being at the plan check counter, who's, again, how are they going to decide depends on how they're feeling.
And I think you could also work with, now we have more specialized consultants too that we can bring on board to kind of relieve, let's say, the creative from taking on all of those, tasks and things to know, right?
Yeah.
You can get energy consultants, you can get expediters that can help you, understand the code and find ways to get to where you want to be from a creative standpoint. Unfortunately, a lot of, smaller scale and scope budgets and projects cannot afford those people. So there is kind of like an unfairness in the access of making a project sustainable or energy compliant is the access of the experts, getting access to be able to hire the right people to help you get there, which, is complicated.
Someday I'm going to do an episode on socioeconomic access to good architecture. That'd be a really cool episode.
Yeah.
You just planted a great seed there for me. I'm totally stealing that one. All right, I'm going to ask you guys the most cliched question in the history of the talk show, but I really want to hear your answer, so I'm doing it anyway. So forgive me, and you can talk about me and talk about what a tool I am afterwards. But I have to ask this question. If you could have any architect, living or dead, on your podcast, and you only get to pick one, each of you get to pick one, who would it be and why? Marina, you get to go first.
It's gotta sound cliche, but I'm probably gonna have Frank Lloyd Wright on just because, I remember when we were living in New York, we saw a retrospective exhibition of his life work, and there was 2 rooms, and I remember stopping in the middle of the room after walking through the exhibition and being amazed by, this, let's say, one office, because it wasn't just a one-man show, right? He had a lot of people working in his office, but how could this office could have produced all of this work? And it just amazed me because I feel like a lot of time now you see offices kind of like repeating the same kind of work. And I just felt like his office, they were just reinventing the wheel or themselves, in so many projects. And it just, laid out all of the creative possibilities that each project brings to an architect, right? And the ability to explore those different paths. So I would be very curious to talk to him. Also, when you look at the timeline as to when this project were happening, I mean, the guy was like living in another dimension, right? Like, I suspect it was an alien of some sort because there is no other reason as to why he could think about architecture and design and buildings in that way at the time those were built. It just kind of blows my mind. So
there seems to be people that have the ability to just stop time, like they just make time stop, they go off and do what they do, and then they start time again, and magically they've gotten everything done while the rest of us were sleeping or about.
Have you heard the story about how Falling Water was designed?
No, let's hear it.
It's, going back to that PBS documentary with Paul Goldberger, this is the story that was told by one of Frank Lloyd Wright's employees at that time when Falling Water was taking place. So I suppose it's an accurate story. I guess the story goes, and I might be kind of misquoting, but the gist of it is that he was hired by, I think it was the Kaufmans, to do this house adjacent to or near the waterfall. And then one day, Frank Lloyd Wright is in his office, located not where the clients were. The clients call, because of course there's no email. They call and say, we're coming over in 4 hours. We want to see the progress of the design. And Wright says, okay, no problem. Hangs up the phone. Apparently nothing had been drawn at that point. So then Frank Lloyd Wright goes to his office, his kind of private space, closes the door and starts drawing like a maniac. And the deal is that oftentimes, as I said in the documentary, architects will draw kind of at a very small scale, like very small, to kind of think up big ideas. But I guess he just sat down, put down a 24 by 36 sheet or whatever it was, and started drawing at a very big scale, which don't do. And in that 3.5 or 4 hours, he drew up the plans and elevations for Falling Water, basically as it is today, in 1 3.5 hour, 4 hour time period. And that was the project. Assuming that's true, I think that's further evidence that he's not of this world.
He really is an alien. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. David, would you pick the? You got to pick somebody else just for the sake of conversation. Yeah. Even your number 2.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I'm not sure if I would choose Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn. I would probably go with Kahn. I would be just fascinated to hear his thought process. A conversation with him would be good, but I'd honestly rather just sit and watch him design something, and maybe ask him why he's making the decisions he's making, and how does he know what to reject as being not a good move versus not a good path versus a good path, and how that all works. I think in terms of the execution of architecture, I don't know if there's many, if any, who are better than him. The way he puts elements, he put elements together is just, it's far superior to almost everyone else. There are certainly architects that produce more obviously dynamic architectures, more artful architectures on the surface, but his level of execution is, I don't think, is surpassed. So yeah, I would be very interested to speak with him.
Wonderful. All right. There's a question that I ask every single episode. All right. And I ask my guests to answer this question from whatever perspective they'd like. What makes a great building?
Well, that's a tough one.
It's a fun question.
There's kind of different ways to think about it, right? I feel like a great building, in like a very big picture way, would be a building that people remember. Would probably be like, that was a great building. It's not specific to that one element of the building. It's just that you remember your experience in that specific building.
That it moves you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Huh. It's a funny thing because I think we had once done a recording, and maybe we did or didn't, I don't know. And we kind of listed all of the many different factors and qualities and things that an architect is thinking about and tries to achieve when they're designing one building. And there's like 12 items on there, ranging from program to beauty to material to sustainability to site response to like everything, right? So I guess the easy answer would be a great building achieves all of those things. But I think what separates, like, the majority of buildings that are out there they're just buildings. And architects do make a distinction between buildings and architecture, and then thirdly, capital A architecture. These are like very different things. Again, the average structure is just a building. I think what makes a building architecture or even capital A architecture is I think Marina's right. It moves the people in some manner. But when you get to the capital A architecture, then you're not just talking about the poetry of that building, but you're also talking about its impact on culture at large. And that's obviously very rare, right? But I think a truly great work of architecture does that. It moves people, but it's also pushing boundaries in terms of culture, and not just construction technology and building technology and using new materials and stuff. I mean, it's critiquing and questioning societal norms. That is the true purpose of architecture, and what a lot of architects aspire to creating. It's just very difficult to do, but I think that's what delineates, let's call it a great building from others, is when it gets to that level and is able to do that.
Oh, you guys are brilliant. Everybody in California who's listening, you need to hire David and Marina to design your home. Like, just do it right now. Drop whatever you're doing and just call them and hire them. I love talking to you guys. All right, before we go, do you have any announcements, anything you'd like to promote or share, anything new that you'd like for our listeners to hear?
Well, it's a funny thing because, as you know, we were talking before the recording, and that's often a question we struggle with if we don't have an event coming up, because a lot of it is just consistency, just being consistent and trying to be really good at what you do every day. Fairly recently, we were published in Sunset Magazine for a project we did, which was super exciting. It took forever to get published these days. We have, it's sort of an announcement, I guess, but we have a project that's in Malibu that we designed, and the property is for sale, and I think it's going to work out. It's an extremely nice property, and it's not really an announcement for the public, but it's exciting for us because it's a very different thing, and it's kind of proof and evidence that great design, and the house wasn't built yet, by the way. It's just a property that we designed this house, but it's evidence that the value of design, in this case connected to real estate value, is very much there. That if you propose something that resonates with people, it will increase the land value and draw buyers in. So again, not really an announcement, but that happened more recently, which I think is really interesting. We have the show, which is always ongoing. We publish once a week. Our office also has a blog, which is active once every couple of weeks or so. And we're just, relative to the age of the average architect, who's like 65, we're on the younger side of that. So for us, it's just a lot of up and coming new things, and again, being active and onboarding projects and things like that.
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute joy speaking with the two of you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,
you,
Joe. Appreciate it.
Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.